I already mentioned the chronic sublethal effects about herring. You will see some of this here, and you will also, we'll all be surprised about some of these effects that crop up in the near future. I mean, these chicks, of course, are supposed to be totally white, and you can see they're oiled even before they were able to fledge and get offshore, just oil from contact with their parents. And this is an answer to Tony Hayward, has the oil gotten in the food chain? Here's an ibis that's preening itself, so of course, consuming this stuff. Oh, and back on the dolphins, of course, they're sort of swimming here in this soup of oil and water mixture. They're aspirating when they breathe the air. We lost about 22 killer whales, I think, in Exxon Valdez, and one theory as to why that happened is when they'd surface, normally when they encounter this seawater air interface, they recognize the different density and open their blowhole and breathe. And it's thought that, we saw them surfacing in oil slicks a lot, that when they encountered the oil slick on the surface, it was different enough density to where they just open their blowhole and aspirate it. But they eat it and breathe the fumes, if nothing else. So we won't belabor this, but of course the intertidal ecology has been nailed by this, and we're going to see, this is the dead, or at least one of the dead sperm whales that was encountered offshore. The plankton community, sargassum, which is very important floating ecosystem, actually attracted a lot of the oil. So, and even terrestrial critters were oiled. What we've seen in Exxon Valdez and some spills, and certainly this one, is just, even if there was no oil left in the ecosystem right now, magically, none of it at all. Of course, that's not true, but even if there were none, just the toxic shock from 500,000 tons of a toxic, relatively persistent chemical dumped in a productive ocean ecosystem is sort of like a nuclear bomb going off. And even if you don't have it continuing, just the long-term ecological reverberations from that will continue. And I don't think, you'll certainly have some ecological effects for decades. Actually, one of the offshore contingency plans done by Shell about 10 years ago predicted, of course, there was very little likelihood of a major blowout, and secondly, if there were, there'd be like 1% to 6% likelihood of that oil contacting shoreline. But if it did, and of course they were wrong about both of those, but if it did, they predicted permanent habitat injury in some of the shoreline ecosystems, loss of habitat, and I think you have already seen that, and I think that will continue. This is something that will be talked about, I think, later today or tomorrow. But basically, some of the modalities of human exposure to hydrocarbons are inhalation, skin contact, and seafood consumption. Some of the symptoms, there's a very good article in the Journal of American Medical Association, just a 2 or 3 page short, alerting doctors to what's screened for toxic exposure. And then the mental health effects. This is something you've all been going through, which is why I would suggest that you avail yourself of the chair massage, perhaps. But it's something that really tore the community I lived in Alaska apart in many ways, and many people left town, and I eventually left. But it tore families apart, and there was high anxiety indices. It's something that a researcher here at University of South Alabama has studied around the world, and he actually calls them corrosive communities, where people are at each other's throats, and you often don't realize it and recognize it as a malady until you're past it and look back on it. So, but this is very real and can cause a lot of problems. And I'll just skip through this. I think we're going to have conversations about this later. The question of what can you do about this? Well, unfortunately, you can't fix the damage done by oil spills directly, often. And this has been one of the biggest limitations of liability that the oil companies have enjoyed throughout the world, and that is they're usually responsible for business losses that their spills cause and directly restorable environmental losses, which is usually about maybe 5% of the total environmental damage caused by a spill. This has been their secret for the last 30 or 40 years. We need to change this as a legislative priority to where even if you can't fix the environmental damage, you can't build more pelicans, you can't restore sperm whales necessarily directly, and these sorts of things. Right now, the industry skates. The responsible party kind of gets out of that. What we need to do is fix it to where you run these non-market economic assessments on what the total value, strange thinking, of the environmental damage that their negligence caused, bill them for that. In this case, it's going to be interesting because if they're proven grossly negligent, which I firmly suspect they will be, you can collect about close to $20 billion in civil fines and then apply it to restoration. I sent BP a letter about a month into this thing, right after they announced the $20 billion Victims Business Loss Claims Fund, and asked them, congratulated them on that. That is unprecedented. It really is the money causes problems too, as I've just been hearing from our shrimper friends, but it is unprecedented. It would have really alleviated a number of the problems we had in Alaska, where 30,000 plaintiffs, 8,000 had died before the case was resolved. And not resolved at a very equitable level in the first place. But in addition to that, I asked them to set up a $20 billion environmental fund. Of course, I didn't get a response to that, but that's kind of the ballpark that I'm thinking of that needs to be funded here, at least $10 to $20 billion for environmental recovery. And the main focus of that, we can talk about this in the breakout sessions, as I see it, is reducing all sources of ecological degradation in the Gulf and on shore. And this is everything. If you can't fix what was broken, all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put the Gulf of Mexico back together again, but you can reduce the other sources of environmental degradation, which includes restoring some sediment flow down the Mississippi to rebuild the shrinking, sinking delta. When I was giving this in Arkansas, where is Arkansas? Somewhere here, I think. I said, you guys have part of this restoration pie too. Oh, thank you. That they have some responsibility. Everyone doing agriculture and flood control and irrigation in the entire Mississippi drainage, look at that, that's an enormous area, contributes to the degradation of the North Gulf of Mexico. And we all know that. So that needs to get fixed. You're going to see an argument, you've already seen it develop. I think the esteemed senator from Louisiana, Ms. Landrieu, recently commented on the MABUS plan, said, it's a very good plan, but we need to make sure there's a direct link to just oil spill damages, something to this effect. Now, this is going to be the argument. If it has a direct nexus to oil spill damages, then you're tremendously limiting the scope of restoration. But I think an easy argument can be made that restoring the Mississippi Delta is one of the principal things that we can and should do out of this. This is kind of fuzzy, I apologize for that. Sort of a estimation of where the Delta was 150 years ago and where it is now. It's pretty remarkably different. And of course, the dead zone from excess fertilizers being used upstream, bad management practices flowing down the Mississippi, creating this anoxic dead zone every summer. That can be mitigated and reduced, and should be. And when I see this picture, I don't see is this, guys out on beaches picking up little tar balls. What I see is this. That's every bit, in fact, more of a problem than this, to me. And so we need a better coastal management plan that looks at these broad scale sources of degradation. And then some other ones that, to the extent that there's overfishing going on, that needs to be mitigated. You can establish protected areas, build artificial nesting islands. The nesting islands, as you all know, have shrunk dramatically. So these birds are just crowded on what's left. That has a direct nexus to the spill because the oil is going to has already killed vegetation that helps to prevent erosion of these islands. So the spill will increase erosion of the seabird nesting islands that are already being eroded. So that's a direct nexus. That should be looked at. These are just my suggestions. I guess the final one here would be looking at all the other chronic sources of pollution in the region and trying to mitigate those to the extent possible too. And of course, preventing other oil spills is a biggie. Exxon Valdez, quickly, you know, this was about the 35th largest in terms of volume of spills around the world. If you use the official volume estimate, but we know that it's probably twice that size. Regardless, it was certainly until this one, we know it was the most environmentally, economically, and socially damaging oil spill ever. This one here certainly tops the charts on economic injury. There's already been $11 billion, I think, paid around as far as economic losses. There's going to be a lot more. We don't know where the environmental injury, but I don't like getting into the game of which oil spill is worse. I just refuse to do that. They're all bad. They're all preventable, and we need to do better at that. And anything above 10 barrels to me is a major spill. I don't need to belabor this. I was over on the spill in China this summer too, in late July, early August. And the Chinese government, I'll show these very quickly. The Chinese government estimated the total volume of the spill was 1,500 tons. I got there, did the math, looked at where the source was. It was a 90,000 ton oil tank that had just been topped off that blew, and then several tanks around it. And the firemen actually opened the valves on some of the other tanks around it, so at least 100,000 tons came out. A bunch burned, and we don't know that ratio, but it was a heck of a lot more than the government's 1,500 tons. These are pretty difficult to look at, but this gentleman right here loses his life here. He drowns in oil. And I can think of 1,000 other ways to die, but not this one. And this is the other gentleman that was drug up the cliff here. I don't know how he fared, but I saw lots of Chinese fishermen that looked like this. They were out there. They were paid. I'll move off of those gruesome scenes. And I told the Chinese government there that, look, when your citizens are drowning in oil, we have a problem and we need to fix it. Those guys were in the water trying to unplug a suction pump, and then they just couldn't swim in the oil. So, solutions here, real quickly. My proposal to the feds has been they need to complete all of this before they allow deep water exploration to continue at the earliest. They need to commission a very comprehensive technical engineering blowout risk assessment. They haven't done that. Blowout prevention, increase the blowout prevention scenarios, better blowout preventers. Some of the recent rules issued by Interior talk about double blind shear rams instead of just the single ram on blowout preventers. That's good. You can hear the industry, you know, crying about that, thinking it's going to be prohibitive. Well, in order to do this right, if it's expensive, that's too bad. That's what you're going to have to do from here on out. So the industry, anyway.